I'm getting tired of seeing these images on Facebook that give you two choices and then say which planet will you move to or which country will you move to. And everybody sees that there's a problem. Nobody wants to vote for the people who we're supposed to be voting on because everybody knows that those people are corrupt and they're not right. So I'm going to reintroduce a theory or an idea and which was very popular at one point in time. This comes from the book Locke, Second Treatise of Government, and this is the Cambridge edition. This is what he has to say on the legislative powers of the government and what they should be. As the good of the society shall require, yet it being only with an intention in everyone the better to preserve himself, his liberty, and property. The power of the society or legislative constituted by them can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. And all this to be directed to no other end but the peace, safety, and public good of the people. Now remember, back on my last video, I showed where in the 1828 dictionary, people, especially for the British-speaking people, was a singular term. It was not a plural term. So keep that in mind as I'm reading these. Legislative power. He's talking about the legislative power. Their power in the utmost bounds of it is limited to the public good of the society. This is a big theme with John Locke. Thirdly, the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government, that's the whole reason men institute governments among them, is so that they can protect their property from the people over there. What happens when your government starts to take that property? And for that which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that the people should have property, because without property there's no reason to be in a political society. For I truly have no property in that which another can take by right from me when he pleases against my consent. And then here at the end of the chapter, he gives the four goals of the legislative branch, the four things that they should do for their governing people. And the first one is that they need to establish all laws and they need to put it out in society, publish it, and they have to use that law against the rich man as well as the poor man and against the favorite of court as well as the countryman at plow. The second is that no law should be designed unless it's for the good of the people. The third is that they can't raise taxes on the property of the people without the people's consent. And just to let y'all know, John Locke would consider your labor your property. He would consider your paycheck your property. And that's where income taxes come from, right? Is your property. That's just Lockean belief. Fourthly, the legislative can't transfer the powers of lawmaking to any other body, to any foreign interest. And that's exactly what they're doing with the TPP and all of these trade deals and all of these trade agreements. So our legislators are doing exactly the opposite of what John Locke would have said to do, and he wrote the Second Treatise of Government. This was probably the most influential book in creating the Constitution for the United States of America. Here he's talking about the executive and federative powers of government. It is almost impracticable to place the force of the Commonwealth in distinct and not subordinate hands, or that the executive and federative powers should be placed in persons that might act separately, whereby the force of the public would be under different commands, which would be apt sometime or other to cause disorder and ruin. So when the legislative and executive federative powers are working against the people, at one time or another, it will cause disorder and ruin. And Locke recognized this in the back of the 17th century. They still study this in schools today. This comes from Cambridge University. I will also be putting a link at the bottom to a Yale open courses in political philosophy. You'll notice that they probably won't talk about the same things I talk about out of the same book. For the second half of this, we'll be talking about the dissolution of government that John Locke writes about. And if you like this presentation, I would highly encourage you to go get a copy of this book and read it for yourself. With that being said, I'm going to read some of this, but some of it I'm just going to put it up and you can pause the video if you would like to read it all. He that will with any clearness speak of the dissolution of government ought in the first place to distinguish between the dissolution of society and the dissolution of government. You can dissolve the government without dissolving the society, but if you dissolve the society, then you will truly end up in an anarchy world. First, when the legislative is altered, and this is where he starts introducing the idea of altering the legislative body without any type of violent confrontation. Legislative is broken or dissolved, dissolution and death follows, for the essence and union of the society consisting in having one will, the legislative, when once established by the majority, so the majority has to establish this new legislative will, has the declaring and, as it were, keeping of that will, the constitution of the legislative is the first and fundamental act of a society. Now, John Locke was all about constitutional government. He wrote certain constitutions for the colonies. So if we were to replace the legislative body, their first act that they would ever have to do before even becoming a legislative body would be writing a constitution and letting the people know what they're about and what their limits will be. Here he's talking about another way that they lose power and are dissolved are when the legislative or prince or executor loses their trust amongst their people. See, the people are the trustors of the government. They trust the government to govern them appropriately. And whenever they break that trust, then it's kind of like they're breaking their obligation to the contract and society in which they live. Whenever the legislatures endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they will put themselves into a state of war with the people who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. And I think that's pretty important right there. They are putting themselves in a state of war with us, the society amongst which they live. Here again he says the people are at liberty to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative, but the state of mankind is not so miserable that they are not capable of using this remedy. Here he says people will suffer mismanagement, wrongs, and inconvenient laws for a long time without mutiny or murmur. But if a long train of abuses, provocations, and artifices, all tending the same way, make themselves the design visible to the people, they cannot but feel what they lie under and see, and where it is going, where they are going. 'Tis not to be wondered that they should be then rouse themselves and endeavor to put rule into such hands, which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected, and that's essentially for your preservation of property. The end of government is the good of mankind, and which is best for mankind, that the people should always expose to the boundless will of tyranny, or that the rulers should be sometimes liable to be opposed when they grow exorbitant in their use of their power and employ it for the destruction and not the preservation of the properties of their people. Here again he talks about whoever uses force puts himself in a state of war amongst those he uses the force against. This, in my mind, is a lot like statutes which are given the force of law and backed by the hand of violence. Here he is talking about the trust that the people put into the government, and who should judge that, who should judge the government. And he says, the people shall be judged, for who shall be judged whether his trustee or deputy acts well and according to the trust reposed in him. He ends the book with this: the legislative can never revert to the people whilst the government lasts. But if they have set limits to the legislatives, the Constitution, and made the supreme power in any person or assembly only temporary, or else when by the miscarriages of those in authority it is forfeited, so they forfeit their power by misusing it, it reverts to the society, and the people have the right to act as supreme and continue the legislative in themselves, or erect a new form, or, under the old form, place it in new hands as they think good. And that's the end of his book. And I can say that most of us can probably agree that we can't take this form and keep going forward with it and just place it in new hands, because it's the system that's corrupt inherently in and of itself. So we can't just place it in new hands, because the bankers will always be there with their checkbooks ready to write new people new checks. Now, I would like to share with you what I understand from these teachings and philosophies. First, our legislative branch has declared war on its own society. Call it the war on poverty, the war on property, the war on free will and drugs, the war on terror. I don't really care what you call it. The fact is that they have declared war on their own society, and they openly tell us about it. We have all seen the long string of abuses with the legislative powers. It has happened slowly over a long period in time, but now the people are waking up to the injustice we all live in on a daily basis. People are starting to give up on the whole idea of voting, but I say just give up on their voting system and make it known we do not consent. I believe America is ready for these ideas, as the voting turnout is already decreasing. I know a lot of naysayers will say it cannot be done, but I attend the philosophy, if you never try, then you have already failed. Let me give you some examples of this working. Anyone ever heard of the Continental Congress? Or maybe how the people of Iceland jailed their prime minister along with banking executives? Or the Door Rebellion that happened in Rhode Island back in 1842. But I must admit that rebellion was unsuccessful. The point is that not only are these ideas an option, they have also happened many times before, so we can study those situations and learn what worked and what did not work. What type of legislative body would I like to see? How about subsidizing biofuels instead of fossil fuels, or helping drug addicts instead of locking them up? How about a legislature that represents the people and not the corporations of this great country? The legislature only gets their power by us, the people, and most of that power is paid for by the taking of wages for labor. In other words, stolen property. I am just conspiracy, and I would just like to conspire with other good people of this planet to leave a better world for our children than the world that we were all born into. Thank you. Bye-bye.